So today I would like to discuss a very difficult process of watchmaker identification. Now, with this seems to be the problem with many of the smaller brands, that the history of the behind the brand, the makers who were behind the fabrication of various watches, can be very difficult to ascertain. And we find this the case with certain watches signed Montandon or Montandon, various variations of Montandon. For example, there are many watches. The most frequent watches we do come across are H. Montandon Locla, L. Montandon Locla, among others. However, today I would like to specifically address the watch signing of Montandon Frères. Now, this is a company which operated between 1818 and perhaps as late as 1918. It's for sure we find these watches being sold by their representative up until at least 1911. However, of interest to us is the three locations where we know that the fabrication was taking place, and these were the cities of Locla and Geneva in Switzerland, and Besançon in France. Now, between 1818 and 1850, the cousins of the brothers who established Montandon Frères came from Locla to France, and they and their children were operating on the watch fabrication side. Now the cousins were directing the watch and clock spring side from Paris and later Rambouillet, and so from 1818 to 1850 we see these Locla, the Locla, Blaise Léon du Locla genealogical branch were operating this. Now this was primarily in Paris under Ulysse Montandon, who functioned for approximately 25 years up until about 1849. His brother Charles Adolphe then took over for approximately the last year up until during 1850, mid-1850, where he departed also back to Locla. Now, the Montandon Frères label was taken up by a representative who was appointed to sell these watches in Paris from their location, and this at first was from 1851 period up till 1892 under Francois Perrenot, and this was their representative. And at 1893, we do find that a F. Cobel took over this representation, and it is very interesting because this is somewhat of a crossover period. F. Cobel appears mainly to be associated only around 1893. Now, he may have been earlier working with F. Perrenot, perhaps in the capacity of an assistant. However, by 1894, the representation is taken over by an Alexandre Bray-Delard, and he carries the brand through up until at least 1911, but perhaps up until the Great War. We are not exactly clear on this because many of the almanacs before the Great War, the French commercial almanacs, seem to be missing, and the data is not available. Now, it is very interesting in this watch signing that generally we find Montandon Frères Locla as the brothers that had gone back to Locla, this Ulysse Montandon, Charles Adolphe Montandon, James Montandon, this group were fabricating for Montandon Frères Paris, and their wares would have gone to Paris, but they also were selling under their own names and for themselves. So the question is how to identify the various makers in this, and for whom were these made. Now, We do know that the fabrication sites, now Locla was used as a fabrication site for Montandon Frères between 1818 and 1888. And we also find Besançon between 1857 and 1888. Now, Geneva is a site used between at least 1857 to 1908. After this date, we have no clear specifications as to where the locations where fabrication was happening. It may have been that by 1911, the whole franchise was wearing down. The last of the Montandon Frères Paris group, this would have been Alfred Montandon. He was moving towards retirement by this time, and he did still have patents where he was receiving an income, and the representation for their technology he was receiving up until approximately the 1914 to 1918 period. He died in 1918, so we know by sure that at this point the brand has ended. Now, it should be said that Montandon Frères Locla, in 1888, they essentially had ceased to exist. The son of Charles Adolphe Montandon, Charles Albert, essentially closed down the brand due to extreme competition out of North America, specifically the American mass production of watches, which produced extremely high quality pieces and at a very cheap price. Now, that is worth another video all unto itself. What exactly happened to Montandon Frères Locla, and I should like to address that very interesting video on what happened to this, where they went. It's a very interesting story. Now, let us return back to the watch signings, because this is the main this is the main way that we can identify who made these watches. It should be noted that Besançon, which was in use as a production and fabrication site between 1857 and 1888, it may have been that they were only producing parts of watches. It could be that it's very possible that these H. Montandon Locla watches were actually, the movements were actually made at Besançon by Henri Louis Montandon and later his son Henri Edouard, but this is very unclear in the data that is left to us. This is a possibility, but it is not a certainty. Now, it is interesting. Let us go back to this transitional period where F. Cobel was had the successorship of the Montandon Frères franchise. Now, this was only in 1893, and we do have a very interesting, unique, actually, the only watch that has been found. It's signed Montandon Frères, then underneath F. Cobel, and Paris Genève, Genève. And this is very interesting. We know specifically that he was maintaining the brand in 1893, and therefore we can date this piece specifically to that date. Now, after this, we really don't know how these watches were being signed. Was it specifically Montandon Frères? And was it Montandon Frères Geneva? Was it only Montandon Geneva? This is a very high probability. We have very many late watches signed Montandon Geneva. Now, Alexander Brédillard participated in a group of watchmakers who was joined by, incidentally, Ulysse Montandon of Geneva, the famed chronometer champion from many of the observatory and chronometer competitions. The two were in a group together where they presented their pieces, and there's some very interesting period articles related to this and what exactly they presented. But clearly Alexander Brédillard was familiar with Ulysse Montandon Robert. This is Ulysse Montandon Robert we're speaking of, not the previous Ulysse Montandon who was at MF Paris. So the question is, how did they sign in this very end period, the watches? Was it Montandon Frères or was it simply Montandon Geneva? This is not entirely clear, and it is incumbent to wait until such pieces materialize from private collections or in auctions for us to see, because this is the only source. The documentation, original sources, articles, and what have you, these are very sparse and exceedingly difficult to unearth, as they say. But let us look at some of the earlier pieces of Montandon Frères local. It should be briefly noted that the house of Montandon Frères was originally established in 1790. This would have been when Charles Frederick Montandon, or his father, began the business. And there is an interesting, unique documentation that we find in this book here, Montres, Horloges et Pendules by Bassermann and von Bertil. And on page 443, we see a very early piece. It is signed Les Frères Montandon, and it is also signed La Chaux-de-Fonds. So this is a very interesting, unique object, which probably dates between this late 1790s to the early 1800s, 18 teens. And this is a unique piece signed La Chaux-de-Fonds, probably by the original brothers and probably from this period. But this predates the original listing in French almanacs of 1818. Now we can continue with Lokla. Now, such a piece we can see in this very beautiful, this is a key wind piece. It is signed Montandon Frères Lokla. It is of the Jules Jurgensen style, and it is very interesting because on the balance staff area, we can see a patent date from March of 1863. So therefore, we can pretty much date this watch to around the early mid-1860s, and this tells us much information. And we also have the serial number in addition, which I believe is in the 19,000s, which also helps us with the dating process. Now, this is another very similar. There's some modifications to the movement. However, we see, again, Montandon Frères Lokla. This particular, this is in the 20,000s. This was probably late 1860s to early 1870s. And once again, we see that such a pocket watch, this gives us much information as to the dating process. But now let us look specifically. We have, these are both Montandon Frères Lokla pieces. This golden pocket watch that was fabricated for the Spanish market has what appears to be, it is not totally legible, but part of the stamp is missing in center. However, this crest would have been the mark of Charles Adolphe Montandon. And we know that he was making for watches for the Mexican market. We see articles between 1866 and 1871 related to the warning of notification of the Mexican public to warn off about possible forgeries. And so this is evidently from this period. We do have the serial number, which helps us to establish. But let us look at this last piece. Now, this last piece has the highest serial number of any Montandon Frères piece that I have seen, and this is in the 24,000s, and this was most likely approximately the mid 1870s. For certain, between 1875 and 1885. And this is an interesting piece because whereas these pieces with enamel dials, now they would, if we were to pull this out and look at the back, very often we'll find the serial number or the last digits of the serial number on them. Enamel dials were made by specialists specializing in enamel dials, and it seems highly likely that these were produced out of La Chaux-de-Fonds, very possibly by the children of Jules Montandon, and we're speaking of Jules Frederick Montandon, who was associated with Montandon Frères. Now, his son Ariste Montandon was located there, and he is to be found in extremely close proximity to the maker of this metallic dial. Now, this metallic dial, signed Montandon Frères Locle, if we reverse this and look, and I will provide close-ups, at the back side, there is a stamp, somewhat eye-shaped or fish eye-shaped stamp, and it clearly reads, Louis Généré La Chaux-de-Fonds. Now, this tells us this was a specialist company that specialized only in the production of metallic cadran. And we know exactly who this individual is, and this is very helpful because his factory can be located at this period between 1875 to 1885 on the adjacent property to Montandon Frères in La Chaux-de-Fonds, and this is on Rue du Grenier. So this was the Fabrique de Cadran. I can show you the picture. It looked like this building here. This was the building, and very interesting, we find this is the maker, Louis Généré, and his wife was Fanny Généré Roulet. And later they would move the Fabrique de Cadran to the Rue du Doubs. But this factory existed for decades beyond his death. In fact, as late as the late 1960s, we do see articles for Louis Généré, La Chaux-de-Fonds, and they're making cadran or dials for wristwatches. So it's quite interesting. But this is an extremely successful, very famous local production that this would have been a quality producer. Now, Ariste Montandon Calam, who was working, he was the son of Jules Frederick, who was associated with Montandon Frères. He was working on Rue de Grenier, and most probably was doing some form of specialized work having to do with cadrans. He was a specialist in fabricant de cadrans. So, and he was also working with a Généré, an Augustine Généré, who was a cadran painter, dial painter. So she was probably signing this. And for example, these metallic dials are also painted. It's interesting whether they, Louis Généré also painted the dials, or did they present the dials forward for a painting by Montandon Frères, La Chaux-de-Fonds. It's an interesting question. However, this is very interesting that we are able to find the very location where such a watch dial was produced, and it just brings the story much more together. So I hope this video was a little bit informative and gives an idea as to some of the history behind this interesting brand. And thank you for your attention. This is just a note for the record. Bye-bye.